Before this video starts, I'd just like to plug my Patreon. For as little as $2 a month, you get early ad-free access to all videos, and higher tiers get their name on the screen and a shout-out at the end of each video. Videos will also be mostly uncensored on there too, so if that interests you, click the link in the description or the pinned comment. Over the last 5 years, I've covered many people who can be considered terrible or just straight up evil, and I've been wondering if there was any iceberg charts out there covering just evil people in general, rather than a specific group like I normally do. And wouldn't you know it, a guy called Unlucky Werewolf on Reddit went and posted one, and there's a lot, 10 layers and almost 30 people on each. It should go without saying that there's no way I can cover them all in one video. So in this one, we'll be covering the first layer. Maybe future videos will be covering more than one. By the way, these layers are based on how well known the people in it are, which will become clear when we get to the first entry. This is the Worst People Iceberg, Part 1. And here's how we know that this iceberg is ordered by how well known someone is. Because how could an iceberg about the worst people ever possibly start with anyone other than Adolf Hitler? Once he consolidated power in Germany in 1933, he moved fast. Political opponents were rounded up and thrown into concentration camps almost immediately, and other political parties were banned. Within months, Germany went from a democracy to a one-party dictatorship. Then came the racial laws. Jewish Germans were stripped of citizenship, banned from professions, and increasingly segregated from public life. Their businesses were seized or boycotted. This escalated into organized violence, most notably during the Kristallnacht in 1938, when synagogues were burned and thousands of Jewish people were arrested. But the full scale of what he set in motion didn't reveal itself until the war. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jewish people, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, gay men, and others were also systematically murdered in camps designed specifically for that purpose. Auschwitz alone saw over 1 million deaths. On top of that, his decision to launch World War II led to somewhere around 70 to 85 million deaths total. He ordered the invasion of Poland, France, the Soviet Union, and more, often with directives that explicitly called for the destruction of civilian populations. The siege of Leningrad starved nearly 1 million people to death over almost 900 days. He knew what was happening and he approved it. And in many cases, he demanded it. And when it all came crashing down, he didn't face consequences for any of it. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces closing in on Berlin, Hitler shot himself in his bunker, dying before the war had even officially ended. Stalin ran the Soviet Union for roughly 3 decades, and the body count from that period is staggering. The Great Purge in the 1930s saw him turn on his own people wholesale. Military leaders, party officials, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. Anyone perceived as a threat, real or imagined, could be arrested, tortured into a confession, and either executed or sent to the Gulag. Estimates vary, but somewhere around 750,000 people were executed during the Purge alone, with over 1 million more sent to labor camps. Speaking of the Gulag system, it operated for decades. Millions passed through those camps, forced into brutal labor in Siberia and elsewhere. A huge number of them never came back. Conditions were deliberately harsh. Starvation, exhaustion, and exposure killed people constantly. Then there's the Holodomor. 1932 and 1933, Stalin's agricultural policies created a famine in Ukraine that killed somewhere between 3.5 and 7 million people. Grain was confiscated from the starving communities. Borders were sealed so people couldn't leave to find food. Whether you call it intentional genocide or criminal negligence, the outcome was the same. After World War II, he deported entire ethnic groups he deemed disloyal. Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, and others were forcibly relocated, with massive death tolls during transit alone. He died in 1953 from a stroke, and there's a widely reported detail that his own guards were too afraid to check on him for hours because disturbing him could get you killed. This tells you a lot about how he operated. Mao Zedong is responsible for more deaths than any other single leader in recorded history, and most of them were his own people. After taking power in 1949, he launched a series of campaigns that each managed to be catastrophic in their own way. The first major one was the land reform movement, where landlords and perceived class enemies were publicly tried and executed. Estimates put the death toll from that alone between 1 and 2 million people. But the real disaster was the Great Leap Forward, which started in 1958. Mao wanted to rapidly industrialize China, so he forced collectivization of agriculture and pushed insane production quotas. Local officials, terrified of punishment, lied about crop yields. The grain that did exist was often seized by the state. The result was the deadliest famine in human history. Somewhere between 15 and 55 million people starved to death over about 4 years. Mao was informed that it was happening and kept the policies going. Then in 1966, he launched the Cultural Revolution. Intellectuals, teachers, doctors, and anyone deemed insufficiently loyal to Mao's ideology were publicly humiliated, beaten, imprisoned, or killed. Students were organized into Red Guard units and essentially turned loose on society. The country descended into years of internal chaos. Death toll estimates range from 500,000 to 2 million. Mao died in 1976, still in power, and his portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Square today, showing that despite all of his horrific actions, the people in charge today still want him revered as some sort of great leader. Pol Pot led the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia from 1975 to 1979. In just under 4 years, his regime killed somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people. That was roughly a quarter of the entire country's population. When the Khmer Rouge took power, they emptied the cities almost overnight. The entire urban population was forced into the countryside at gunpoint to work in agricultural labor camps. Families were separated. Anyone with an education, anyone who spoke a foreign language, anyone who wore glasses even, was considered a threat to the new order and could be marked for execution. The regime wanted to create an agrarian society starting from what they called Year Zero. Currency was abolished and schools were shut down. Even hospitals were closed and religion was banned. The whole country was essentially turned into a forced labor state, with people working in rice fields under brutal conditions on near starvation rations. Then there was Tuol Sieng, a former high school converted into a prison and interrogation center. Around 17,000 people passed through it, and only a handful survived. Prisoners were forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit before being transported to killing fields outside the city and executed. Pol Pot was eventually overthrown when Vietnam invaded in 1979, but he was never properly brought to justice. He lived in the jungle for years and died in 1998 under house arrest from his own former allies. He reportedly denied responsibility for everything, right up until the end. Ted Bundy confessed to 30 murders before his execution, but the actual number is believed to be higher. His victims were young women, mostly college-aged, and his crimes spanned multiple states throughout the 1970s. What made Bundy particularly dangerous was how he operated. He was educated, articulate, and considered conventionally attractive. He used that to his advantage constantly. He would fake injuries, wear a cast or crutches, and ask women for help carrying things to his car. Once they were close enough, he'd overpower them. He also impersonated authority figures, including police officers, to gain trust. He killed across Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, and for a long time, law enforcement in different states didn't connect the cases. He was eventually arrested in Utah in 1975 and later convicted of kidnapping. While awaiting trial in Colorado for murder, he escaped from custody twice. The second time he made it all the way to Florida, where he attacked students at a sorority house at Florida State University, killing 2 women and injuring others. He killed again shortly after. He was finally captured for good in February 1978. During his Florida trial, he chose to act as his own attorney, which turned the proceedings into something of a spectacle. He was convicted and sentenced to death. He was executed by electric chair in January 1989. In the days before his execution, he gave a series of interviews where he tried to blame his crimes on pornography, though obviously most experts didn't buy this. Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Most of his victims were young black men, and nearly all of the killings took place in his Milwaukee apartment. He would approach men, often at bars or malls, and lure them back to his apartment with offers of money or drinks. Once there, he would drug them and kill them. What he did afterward is what sets his case apart from most other serial killers. He kept body parts, and he would photograph the process. He also attempted crude preservation methods because he wanted to keep his victims with him. He later told investigators he didn't want them to leave. One of the most disturbing parts of the case is how many chances there were to stop him. In May 1991, one of his victims actually escaped the apartment and was found on the street. 2 Milwaukee police officers responded, but Dahmer talked his way out of it, convincing them the boy was his adult boyfriend, who had simply too much to drink. They handed the boy back to him. Dahmer killed him the same night. He was finally caught in July 1991, when another intended victim escaped and flagged down police. Officers went to the apartment and found photographs and remains that made the scale of what happened immediately clear. Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms and was killed in prison in 1994 by a fellow inmate. Charles Manson never actually killed anyone himself, at least not in the murders he's famous for. What he did was build a group of followers devoted enough to kill on his command. By the late 1960s, Manson had assembled what became known as the Manson family, a group of mostly young people living communally in California. He controlled them through a mix of manipulation, drug use, and a delusional ideology he'd cobbled together. He convinced his followers that a race war was coming, something he called Helter Skelter, after the Beatles song, and that the murders would help trigger it. On August 8, 1969, members of the family entered the home of actress Sharon Tate in Los Angeles. Tate was 8.5 months pregnant at the time. She and 4 others in the house were killed. The following night, Manson directed his followers to the home of Leno and Rosemary LeBlanca, where both were murdered. The killings were intentionally made to look chaotic and cult-like, with words written on the walls, because Manson wanted the crimes to be blamed on Black Americans and spark the conflict he'd been predicting. It took months before the cases were connected back to him. When they were, Manson and several of his followers were tried and convicted. He received the death penalty, which was later commuted to life in prison when California temporarily abolished capital punishment. Manson spent the rest of his life in prison, never expressing genuine remorse. He died in 2017 at the age of 83. This next person probably doesn't need much of an introduction, considering his name has been all over the news and social media for years now. Jeffrey Epstein ran what has been described as one of the most extensive sex trafficking operations in modern American history, and he did it while socializing with some of the most powerful people in the world. For years, Epstein used his wealth and connections to recruit and abuse underage girls. Young women, often from vulnerable backgrounds, were brought to his properties in Manhattan, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and his private island in the US Virgin Islands. They were promised money for massages, which then turned into sexual abuse. Many of these victims were then used to recruit other girls, creating a pipeline that kept the operation going for well over a decade. He was first investigated in 2005 after a parent reported him to the police in Palm Beach. The FBI got involved and identified dozens of victims, but in 2008, he received what's now considered one of the most outrageous plea deals in legal history. A federal prosecutor named Alexander Acosta allowed Epstein to plead guilty to state charges, serve just 13 months in a private wing of a county jail with work release privileges, and register as a sex offender. The victims weren't even notified of the deal, which violated federal law. He was arrested again in July 2019 on federal sex trafficking charges. A month later, he was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. His death was ruled a suicide, though the circumstances raised widespread suspicion, given that he'd been taken off suicide watch and the camera near his cell reportedly malfunctioned. His associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, was later convicted for her role in the trafficking operation, but many questions about who else was involved remain unanswered. Osama Bin Laden was born into an incredibly rich and powerful Saudi Arabian family, but he threw it all away when he founded Al-Qaeda in the late 1980s and spent the next 2 decades orchestrating terrorist attacks that killed thousands of people across multiple continents. The first major attack linked to him was the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which killed 6 people and injured over 1,000. Then, in 1998, Al-Qaeda carried out simultaneous bombings of the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. 224 people were killed, the vast majority of them African civilians who had nothing to do with American foreign policy. In 2000, Al-Qaeda operatives attacked the USS Cole while it was docked in Yemen, killing 17 American soldiers. And then, obviously, September 11, 2001, Bin Laden planned and authorized the hijacking of 4 commercial airplanes. 2 hit the World Trade Center, 1 hit the Pentagon, and a 4th crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people were killed that morning. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in history, and it reshaped global politics in ways that are still playing out today. The wars that followed in Afghanistan and Iraq led to hundreds of thousands of additional deaths over the next 2 decades. After 9/11, Bin Laden went into hiding, eventually settling in a compound in Pakistan, not far from a Pakistani military academy. He lived there for years while the largest manhunt in history was underway. US intelligence eventually tracked him through a courier network, and on May 2, 2011, Navy SEALs raided the compound and killed him. Because of his death, he never faced trial and never answered publicly for any of the chaos and suffering he caused. Jack the Ripper is probably the most famous unidentified serial killer in history, and the reality is we actually don't know that much for certain. What we do know is that in the autumn of 1888, someone murdered at least 5 women in the Whitechapel district of London. The 5 victims generally agreed upon by historians are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. All 5 were women living in extreme poverty, and most were involved in sex work to survive. They were targeted specifically because they were vulnerable and unlikely to be missed by anyone with influence. The killings escalated in severity. The later victims showed evidence of significant anatomical knowledge on the part of the killer, which led investigators at the time to suspect the murderer might have had medical experience or surgical training. This was never confirmed. The case became a media sensation partly because of letters sent to the police and newspapers claiming to be from the killer. The most famous was the, quote, "Dear Boss" letter, which coined the name Jack the Ripper. Most researchers today believe the majority of these letters were hoaxes written by journalists, though a couple remain genuinely debated. The Metropolitan Police investigated over 100 suspects and never made an arrest. The case was eventually filed as unsolved in 1892. Since then, hundreds of theories have been put forward, naming everyone from local tradesmen to members of the royal family. None have been proven conclusively. The Zodiac Killer operated in Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He confirmed 5 murders and claimed to have killed as many as 37 people, though that higher number has never been verified. The confirmed attack started in December 1968, when 2 teenagers were shot while sitting in a car in a parking area near Vallejo. About 6 months later, the Zodiac attacked another couple in a similar setting. The killer seemed to enjoy the attention. He sent letters and coded ciphers to local newspapers, demanding they be published or he would kill again. He gave himself the name the Zodiac and included a cross-circle symbol that became iconic. Some of the ciphers were eventually sold. One, cracked in 2020 by a team of amateur codebreakers, contained a message about enjoying killing. Another cipher remains unsolved to this day. In September 1969, he stabbed 2 college students at Lake Berryessa, and in October that year, he shot a taxi driver named Paul Stein in San Francisco. After the Stein murder, he sent a piece of the driver's shirt to a newspaper to prove he was responsible. The investigation involved multiple law enforcement agencies and produced several suspects over the years, the most prominent being Arthur Lee Allen, though he was never charged. The case officially remains open, and to this day, the Zodiac has never been identified or caught. John Wayne Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and teenage boys in the Chicago area between 1972 and 1978. He buried most of them in the crawl space beneath his own house. Gacy was well known in his community. He ran a construction business, volunteered at local events, and performed at children's parties as a clown character he called Pogo. He was also politically active, even being photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter. None of this stopped him from killing people on a regular basis for 6 years. Some of his victims worked for his construction company. Others he lured with promises of employment or money. He would restrain them under various pretenses and then kill them. 26 bodies were eventually recovered from the crawl space under his house. Others were found in nearby rivers after he ran out of room to bury them. He first came to police attention when a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest disappeared in December 1978 after telling his mother he was going to talk to a contractor about a job. That contractor was Gacy. When investigators searched his property, the smell from the crawl space led them to start digging. What they found over the following weeks made it one of the largest crime scenes in American history at the time. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders in 1980. During his trial, he attempted an insanity defense, which the jury rejected. He spent 14 years on death row before being executed by lethal injection in 1994. 8 of his victims have still never been identified. Benito Mussolini took power in Italy in 1922 and spent the next 2 decades turning the country into a fascist state. He is sometimes treated as a lesser figure compared to Hitler, but his record on its own is pretty terrible. Once in control, he used very similar tactics to Hitler by banning opposition parties, dismantling democratic institutions, and establishing a secret police force called the OVRA that monitored and persecuted political opponents. Press freedom was eliminated, labor unions were crushed, and anyone who publicly opposed the regime risked imprisonment or exile. His foreign policy was built on imperial ambition, and the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 is where that gets particularly particularly ugly. Italian forces used mustard gas against Ethiopian soldiers and civilians, which was already banned under international law. The campaign killed an estimated 275,000 to 750,000 Ethiopians. After the conquest, Italian forces carried out mass executions in retaliation for an assassination attempt on a colonial officer, killing an estimated 19,000 people in Addis Ababa over the span of a few days in 1937. He also dragged Italy into World War II alongside Nazi Germany, a decision that cost hundreds of thousands of Italian lives. Italian forces participated in the occupation of Yugoslavia, where civilians were interned in concentration camps, and after the first German occupation of Italy in 1943, Mussolini's puppet state in the north actively assisted in the deportation of Italian Jews to Nazi death camps. He was captured by Italian partisans in April 1945 while trying to flee to Switzerland. They executed him the following day. His body was hung upside down at a gas station in Milan. Pablo Escobar ran the Medellin cartel in Colombia and at his peak was responsible for roughly 80% of the cocaine smuggled into the United States, but the drug trafficking itself is almost secondary to the sheer volume of violence he inflicted on his own country. Escobar's approach to anyone who stood in his way was very straightforward. You either took the bribe or you got killed. Judges, politicians, police officers, journalists, hundreds of people in public life were assassinated on his orders. In 1989, he had presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán shot dead at a campaign rally because Galán had promised to crack down on the cartels and support extradition to the United States. That same year, his organization bombed Avianca Flight 203, killing all 107 people on board. The target was a single politician who wasn't even on the plane. A few months later, a truck bomb was detonated outside the DAS building, Colombia's secret police headquarters, killing over 60 people and injuring hundreds more. He waged an all-out war against the Colombian state specifically to prevent extradition. The campaign was so violent that the government eventually gave in and changed the constitution to ban extradition. He then negotiated his own surrender and was allowed to serve time in a custom-built prison called La Cathedral, which he'd essentially designed himself. When the government tried to move him to a real prison, he simply walked out. He was tracked down and killed by Colombian security forces in December 1993. By that point, the violence connected to his operation had killed an estimated 4,000 people. Ivan IV ruled Russia from 1547 to 1584, and he earned the nickname Terrible for very good reason. The second half of his reign was defined by paranoia, mass killings, and a personal cruelty that was extreme even by the standards of the time. In 1565, he created a personal force called the Oprichniki, essentially a state-sanctioned terror squad that answered only to him. Their job was to root out anyone Ivan suspected of disloyalty, and their methods were deliberately brutal. They dressed in black, rode black horses, and carried symbols of brooms and severed dog heads to represent their mission of sweeping away treason. Entire noble families were wiped out on his orders, often with no real evidence of any conspiracy. The worst single event was the massacre of Novgorod in 1570. Ivan became convinced that the city's leaders were planning to defect to Lithuania. He led his forces there and spent 5 weeks killing the population. Estimates from the death toll range from 2,000 to as high as 60,000, though the actual number is hard to pin down given the era. Families were thrown into the Volkhov River. The city's economy and population never fully recovered during his lifetime. He also killed his own son, Ivan Ivanovich, in 1581. By most accounts, he struck him in the head with a pointed staff during an argument. His heir died from the injury days later. There's a famous painting by Ilya Repin depicting the moment immediately after, showing Ivan holding his dying son with a look of horror on his face. He died in 1584, reportedly while playing chess. Vlad III, commonly known as Vlad the Impaler, ruled Wallachia in what is now southern Romania during the mid-1400s. His reputation comes almost entirely from the methods he used to punish and kill people, which were extreme even for a period that wasn't exactly known for restraint. His name says most of it. His preferred method of execution was impalement, where victims were forced onto large wooden stakes and left to die slowly, sometimes over the course of days. He used this on a massive scale on enemy soldiers, political rivals, criminals, and entire civilian populations who he considered disobedient. Some accounts describe fields of impaled bodies numbering in the thousands, arranged deliberately to be seen by approaching enemies. The most cited incident is from 1462, when Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II marched toward Wallachia with a large invasive force. According to multiple sources, the Sultan's army encountered a field outside Vlad's capital containing roughly 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners. The site reportedly caused Mehmed to reconsider his advance. Whether the exact number is accurate is debated, but the event is referenced in both European and Ottoman sources. Vlad also targeted the local nobility of Wallachia, many of whom he suspected of involvement in his father's assassination. He had large numbers of them killed at a banquet, and others were forced into labor building his fortress at Ponari. Total death estimates attributed to Vlad range from 40,000 to 100,000, though records from this period are obviously unreliable. He was killed in battle around 1476 or 1477, and his head was reportedly sent to the Ottoman Sultan as proof. Nero became Roman Emperor in 54 AD at the age of 16, and over the next 14 years he developed a reputation as one of the most destructive rulers in Roman history. There's some debate among historians about how much of what was written about him is accurate versus political slander, but even the more conservative assessments aren't flattering. He had his own mother, Agrippina, murdered in 59 AD. She had been instrumental in getting him to power, but Nero grew tired of her influence. After a failed attempt to kill her in a staged boat collapse, he simply sent soldiers to finish the job. His first wife, Octavia, was exiled and then executed on false charges of adultery. His second wife, Poppaea, died while pregnant, and several sources claim Nero kicked her to death during an argument. Then there's the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The fire burned for over a week and destroyed large portions of the city. Whether Nero himself actually started it is unclear and probably unlikely, but what he did afterward is well documented. He used the cleared land to build an enormous palace complex for himself, called the Domus Aurea. He also blamed the fire on Christians and launched a persecution campaign against them. Christians were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or set on fire to serve as lighting at night. By the end of his reign, he had alienated the Senate, the military, and much of the public. When a revolt finally came in 68 AD, he found himself with no allies left. He fled Rome and killed himself before he could be captured. His reported last words were, quote, "What an artist dies in me." Caligula ruled Rome for less than 4 years from 37 to 41 AD, and in that short time became one of the most notorious emperors in Roman history. As with Nero, there's a question of how much ancient sources exaggerated, but the overall picture is consistently bad across multiple writers. The first 6 months or so of his reign were apparently fine. Then, according to historians, he fell seriously ill, and when he recovered, his behavior changed completely. He began executing people with little or no justification. Senators, former allies, and members of his own family were killed on his orders. His cousin and adopted son, Gemellus, was forced to commit suicide. His father-in-law met the same fate. He developed a habit of humiliating the Roman Senate. He supposedly threatened to make his horse a consul, which was likely intended as a deliberate insult to the senators rather than actual madness. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot and made some of them fight as gladiators for his entertainment. He declared himself a living god and had temples built in his own honor. He reportedly had the heads of statues of various gods removed and replaced with likenesses of his own face. He also ordered a statue of himself to be erected inside the temple in Jerusalem, which nearly caused a revolt in Judea. The order was only dropped after significant pushback from local officials. His spending was also reckless. He burned through the substantial treasury left by his predecessor Tiberius in under 2 years, then resorted to seizing property and imposing arbitrary taxes to fund his lifestyle. He was assassinated in January 41 AD by members of his own Praetorian Guard. Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous land empire in history, and the cost of that in human life is almost incomprehensible. Historians believe his conquests were responsible for the deaths of around 40 million people, which at that time may have been roughly 10% of the world's entire population. His military strategy relied heavily on terror as a tool. When a city surrendered without resistance, it was often spared. When a city resisted, the consequences were total. The population of entire cities was systematically killed after they fell, and this wasn't random battlefield violence either. It was a deliberate policy designed to make the next city think twice about fighting back. The destruction of Khwarezmia is probably the most well-documented example. After the local Shah executed Mongol trade envoys, Genghis Khan invaded the empire with roughly 100,000 to 200,000 troops. Cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, and Nishapur were devastated. At Nishapur, the Mongols killed virtually everyone in the city after it resisted. Some accounts claim the heads of the dead were stacked into pyramids. The region, which had been one of the most prosperous in the Islamic world, took centuries to recover. Similar patterns played out across northern China, Central Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe. Entire irrigation systems were destroyed in Mesopotamia and Persia, turning formerly fertile land into desert. Some historians argue that certain regions didn't return to their pre-Mongol population levels until the 20th century. Genghis Khan died in 1227, still actively campaigning. His successors continued expanding the empire using the same brutal methods. Richard Ramirez terrorized the Los Angeles area over a period of about 14 months in 1984 and 1985. He was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries, though the actual numbers may be even higher. What made Ramirez particularly unsettling was the randomness of his crimes. Most serial killers have a type. Ramirez didn't seem to. His victims ranged in age from their 20s to their 80s. He attacked men and women, and he had no consistent method either, using firearms, knives, and blunt objects as weapons. He would break into homes at night, usually through unlocked doors or windows, and attack whoever was inside. There was no geographic pattern tight enough for residents to know if they were in a danger zone. The entire greater Los Angeles area felt at risk. He also left behind satanic symbols at some of his crime scenes and forced victims to swear allegiance to Satan during attacks. This earned him the media nickname the Night Stalker, and added a layer of public fear that went beyond the usual serial killer coverage. He was identified after a fingerprint match in August 1985. His mugshot was broadcast widely, and he was actually recognized and chased down by a group of residents in East Los Angeles while trying to steal a car. They held him until police arrived. During his trial, he showed no remorse. He flashed a pentagram drawn on his palm at reporters, and at one point told the courtroom, quote, "Hail Satan." He was convicted of all counts and sentenced to death in 1989. He died on death row in 2013 from complications related to lymphoma. Jim Jones was the leader of the People's Temple, a cult that he built up over decades before ultimately leading over 900 people to their deaths in a single day. By the mid-1970s, Jones relocated most of his followers from California to a remote settlement in Guyana, South America, that he called Jonestown. He sold it as a utopian community, but in practice it was a labor camp. Members worked long hours in the fields, were subjected to public humiliation sessions, had their passports confiscated, and were prevented from leaving, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Jones controlled what people ate, who they could speak to, and how they spent every hour of the day. He also conducted fake suicide drills, which he called White Nights, to test his followers' loyalty and desensitize them to the idea of dying on his command. In November 1978, US Congressman Leo Ryan flew to Jonestown to investigate reports from concerned family members. When some residents tried to leave with Ryan's delegation, Jones had them ambushed at a nearby airstrip. Ryan and 4 others were shot and killed on the tarmac. That same evening, Jones ordered the entire community to drink cyanide-laced Flavor Aid. Those who resisted were forced at gunpoint or held down and injected. 918 people died, including 304 children. The children had no say in any of it. Their parents, in many cases, administered the poison themselves because Jones told them to. Jones died from a gunshot wound to the head. Whether it was self-inflicted or someone else pulled the trigger has never been definitively established. Either way, while his followers were dying and writhing in agony around him, he chose to take a quick and painless route instead. The I-70 killer is one of those cases where someone committed a string of murders in broad daylight across multiple states and simply vanished. He has never been identified. In the spring of 1982, over the course of about a month, 6 store clerks were shot and killed in small retail shops located just off Interstate 70 in the Midwest. The first was Robin Fuldauer, a 26-year-old working at a Payless shoe store in Indianapolis on April 8th. She wasn't even supposed to be there that day. A co-worker had called in sick. This was part of a consistent pattern. The killer would enter a small shop, usually a specialty store with only one person working, shoot the clerk in the back of the head with a .22 caliber handgun, take a small amount of cash, and leave. On April 11th, he killed 2 women at a bridal shop in Wichita. Investigators believe he didn't expect there to be a second person inside. Later that month, he killed a man named Michael McCown at a ceramics shop. McCown had long hair and the shop was called Sylvia's after his mother. Police believe the killer targeted the store thinking a woman would be working there. 2 more killings followed in Missouri in early May. The weapon itself was considered unusual. It was an Elmer Werker, a German Navy target pistol from the World War I era. FBI profilers theorized it was likely a family heirloom, not something you typically bring on a killing spree. There were some witnesses. A man at the bridal shop in Wichita came face to face with the killer, who told him to leave. A composite sketch was drawn, and the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted. Investigators also believe the killer may have struck again in Texas in 1993 and 1994. In 2021, a multi-city task force was formed to take another look using advances in DNA technology, but as of now, the case remains open. Whoever the I-70 killer was, he has never been caught. Kim Jong-un took power in North Korea in 2011 after his father's death, and despite being the youngest leader the country has had, he's proven to be just as ruthless as his predecessors. One of his first major moves was consolidating power by eliminating anyone he saw as a potential rival, including his own family. In 2013, he had his uncle, Jong Song-taek, who is considered the second most powerful man in the country, publicly arrested during a party meeting and executed days later. In 2017, his half-brother Kim Song-nam was assassinated in a Malaysian airport when two women smeared VX nerve agent on his face. Under his leadership, North Korea's political prison camps have continued operating at full capacity. The UN estimated in 2014 that between 80,000 and 120,000 people are held in these camps, where forced labor, starvation, torture, and execution are routine. Entire families are imprisoned for the perceived disloyalty of a single relative, a practice known as, quote, 3 generations of punishment. People born inside the camps may live and die there without ever having committed any offense. Meanwhile, he has poured enormous resources into the country's nuclear weapons program, while the general population faces chronic food shortages. International aid organizations have estimated that millions of North Koreans are undernourished. Information is so tightly controlled that citizens have virtually no access to outside media, and defectors have described being taught from childhood that Kim Jong-un and the two leaders who came before him are essentially gods. He remains in power today, with no indication of that changing anytime soon. On April 19, 1995, Timothy McVeigh parked a rented truck packed with roughly 4,800 pounds of homemade explosives in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. At 9:02 in the morning, the bomb detonated. 168 people were killed, including 19 children who were in a daycare center on the second floor of the building. Over 680 others were injured. It was the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. McVeigh planned the attack as retaliation against the federal government. He was fixated on the government's handling of the siege of Waco, Texas in 1993, where 76 people died, and the Ruby Ridge incident in 1992. He deliberately chose April 19th because it was the second anniversary of the fire at Waco. He wanted to send a message and chose a building full of civilians to do it. He knew there were children in the building. When asked about it later, he referred to them as, quote, collateral damage. In interviews, he compared the deaths to the way the US military talks about civilian casualties in wartime and showed no remorse whatsoever. He was pulled over about 90 minutes after the bombing for driving without a license plate. An officer noticed he was carrying a concealed weapon and arrested him. He was days away from being released on weapons charges before forensic evidence connected him to the bombing. McVeigh was convicted on 11 federal counts, including the use of a weapon of mass destruction. He was executed by lethal injection in June 2001. He declined a final prayer and reportedly considered the execution a form of martyrdom. Sean Combs, better known as Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, and of course just Diddy, was one of the most powerful figures in the music industry for decades. In 2024, that all came apart. In November 2023, his former longtime girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura, known as Cassie, filed a lawsuit accusing him of years of physical and sexual abuse. Combs settled the suit within a single day for a reported $20 million. Months later, surveillance footage from a hotel in 2016 surfaced, showing Combs kicking and dragging Ventura in a hallway. He posted a video apology on social media. After that, dozens more civil lawsuits piled up, with accusers alleging sexual assault, abuse, and coercion stretching back years. Attorneys working with accusers said they had heard from roughly 3,000 people with allegations against him. In March 2024, federal agents raided a number of his properties. In September of that year, he was arrested and indicted in the Southern District of New York on charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He pleaded guilty and was denied bail 3 times. His trial began in May 2025. Prosecutors argued that Combs used his power and status to coerce women into drug-fueled sexual encounters he called freak-offs, and that he intimidated and threatened those around him to keep it all hidden. Multiple witnesses testified, including Ventura and former employees. In July 2025, the jury found him not guilty of racketeering and sex trafficking, but guilty on 2 counts of transporting individuals for prostitution. He was sentenced in October 2025 to 50 months in prison and a $500,000 fine. His legal team has called the sentence unjust and filed an appeal. He is currently incarcerated and still faces numerous civil lawsuits. And of course, to say that people are unsatisfied with his current sentence would be a huge understatement. Henry Kissinger served as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State under Nixon and Ford during the 1970s, and the policies he pushed during that period left a body count that most people would never associate with an American diplomat. The most well-known case is Cambodia. In 1969, Kissinger helped orchestrate a secret bombing campaign called Operation Menu, which dropped over 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia over 4 years. The campaign was hidden from Congress and the public. Estimates of Cambodian civilian deaths range from 150,000 to 500,000. The destabilization caused by the bombing is widely credited with helping the Khmer Rouge rise to power, which, as we've already covered, led to the deaths of nearly 2 million more people. Then there's Chile. In 1973, Kissinger was directly involved in efforts to undermine and overthrow the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. The CIA-backed coup brought Augusto Pinochet to power, whose military dictatorship went on to kill over 3,000 people, torture tens of thousands more, and ruled through fear for nearly 2 decades. When asked about it, Kissinger's position was essentially that the US had the right to prevent a socialist government from taking hold in Latin America. In 1971, during the Bangladesh Liberation War, Pakistan's military carried out a campaign of mass killings in East Pakistan. The US consul in Dhaka sent a cable calling it genocide and urging Washington to act. Kissinger and Nixon ignored it and continued supporting Pakistan because of its usefulness as a diplomatic channel to China. Estimates of the death toll range from 300,000 to 3 million. He also gave a green light to Indonesia's invasion of East Timor in 1975, which led to an occupation that killed roughly a quarter of the population over the following decades. Kissinger died in 2023 at the age of 100, and he was never charged with anything. And that's the end of the video, folks. I'd like to thank all of my patrons for their continued support, especially those whose names you're seeing on screen now, particularly Sonny Hauser, Charlie Boyle, Bailey Cosmic Black Metal 96, Mimi, Pizza Guy 111, Light into Sunlight, KJ Musical, Losanna, Brandon Field, Helen Korn, Kyle, BAN, Brendan O'Connell, Adam Clayton, Count Ligula, Danny Jade, Paul Mendoza, Alex Christmas, Bella Schwartz, Belle Siegel, Stimulate, Inquis Cesarius, and Dick the Cock Johnson and the Woodmaster of WrestleMania 69 or Maybe Not Dude. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.